I'm Matt Seeger. I'm from Wayne State University in Detroit. I'm delighted that you all joined us today. I mean, it's great to be back in Orlando for this particular conference. I was talking earlier to some folks about how 4 years ago at this conference, we sat in a bar and said, there's this thing that's happening in the world. I wonder how serious it's going to be and if we'll ever be studying this thing in the future. And Martin assured me that everything was going to be fine. It wouldn't be a big deal. No, I think you said that. So, and it turned out to be a thing. And so many years later, we're back and delighted to have a chance to continue our conversation about bad things. And there have been some other bad things that happened in the world. In February of 2014, Russia annexed Crimea, which was part of Ukraine. And then in February of 2022, there was a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. This has been a disaster on many levels, and I will note that in the U.S., the area of crisis communication has spent some time thinking about war as a crisis, but it hasn't been a central component of what we focus on. I think that has to change, and this panel today, I think, will help change some of that conversation. These events that we think of as war create all kinds of secondary cascading impacts, as well as very direct impacts. The destruction of many parts of Ukraine, physical destruction of the infrastructure, the economic turmoil that this has caused, including the disruption in the supply chain, fundamental disruption in the supply chain, which has created all kinds of secondary impacts. The refugee crisis, the estimates are between 50,000 and 90,000 Russians have been killed in this conflict, as many as 30,000 Ukrainians, soldiers, 10,000 civilians. So this is clearly the kind of serious disruptive event that crisis communication scholars should be focusing on, specifically because war is not just fought on the battlefield, it's also fought with messages, a variety of types of messages. So today, we're going to hear about how the war in Ukraine is not just a war on the battlefield, but is also a communication event, a crisis communication event. And I'm delighted to have just an amazing panel today to present. I've asked each of the presenters to take about 5 to 7 minutes, which will be very fast talking, I'm sure, but that will leave us some time for some conversation at the end. So I'm going to do quick introductions, try not to butcher names too much, and then we will go in the order as the presenters are listed in the program. So William Nowling from Michigan State University directs the Communication, Leadership, and Strategy major in that department. He is a professor of practice. Doug Jordan is with the Joint Special Operations University. He is the course director for SOF Security Cooperation and Information-related capabilities. He has 22 years in special operations. Gigi Khabib Rachmaninoff, close, is a first-year communication and media graduate student at the University of Northern Iowa. Jeff Brand is an associate professor of public relations at the University of Northern Iowa. Karina Buznayu, something like that. Karina, where are you? Close, not, I'm sure pretty far, but close. Is currently an associate professor at SNSPA Romania, teaching crisis communication and social media. Dr. Alina Baragona is a Romanian communication scholar with a strong interest in disinformation and media information, literacy, government communication, and the impact of technology on democracy. And finally, certainly not least, but finally, will be Sunny Patel, who will wrap us all up. He is award-winning researcher and former National Institutes of Health at the Fogarty Global and a Fogarty Health Global Scholar. So we have an amazing panel today to talk about what is one of the defining crises. It seems like I say that with every crisis now because they're all so big, but one of the defining crises of our time. So we will begin with Professor Nowling.
The things that I'm interested in studying is how organizations, primarily businesses, respond to risk and crisis. And I have a personal interest in this is that my wife is a Ukrainian, not by birth, but by birth by her parents, but she's a first generation American, but a Ukrainian. So our household has always had a big interest in what was going on in Ukraine, even before the invasion. So working on this is something that is not only a professional passion for me, but it also is a personal one. And I think the interesting thing is that as soon as organizations, or as soon as Russia began moving troops into Ukraine, businesses began examining how they were going to respond and in what way. And just as soon as, in some ways that they did, some decided to leave, some decided to invest completely, some decided to phase out operations, some didn't do anything. But the ones that decided to move and divest made points of talking about how they were doing that with their stakeholders. They, through press releases, through announcements, if they were publicly traded companies, they had to file 10-Ks in the United States for the SEC to note that. And so as soon as companies started doing this, scholars started to take an interest in what was going on. And we have I think two interesting pieces of information just for your reference up here. There's the work done by the Yale School of Management by Jeff Sonnenfeld and his group in the Chief Executive Leadership Institute. And they've managed, they've tracked what organizations are doing and whether they're staying. And there's also work that's been done through the Kyiv School of Economics Institute in tracking what other organizations have done. And they look at this from a business standpoint and also from a profit standpoint. And so there has been some profit, some benefit for organizations to move out of Russia, and they've seen that in their stock prices. But I'm really interested in, are there only the business considerations that are driving these decisions? And if they're not, what are those other reasons that they're divesting from Russia? And I think that the answer is in the statements. And with the work from Kessel and Kolarek, they have made their data publicly available. So I was able to, if there was a statement from a company, I was able to capture that statement by scraping it off the internet. And then I used that to create a corpus of all of the documents. And I wanted to see, what are they talking about? What are the terms and the structures that they're doing about? And what does, and how do those words interact? And more of an exploratory work before we start looking at, are there some statistical inferences we can start to make from the languages that they're using here. And so I came up with and found four primary topic models: global models that talk where language is talking about, or organizations are talking about their place within the global environment, where organizations are talking about their corporate social responsibility activities and their connection to their stakeholders, where businesses are talking about their customers, and when they're talking about operations. And the number underneath that probability number, is just the likelihood that a word in this network, in this corpus of documents, falls into one of those four categories. I looked at 10, but these are the four most important ones. And so global, we're talking about those words that talk about business support, about providing services, about the countries that they serve, and the products that are going in and out of those countries. In corporate social responsibility, words that focus on people, about sharing, about providing information, about support to employees in Russia, to customers in Ukraine, to the people of Ukraine, and service within the region. Customer, obviously, they're looking at product and the impact and how they're going to continue or not providing that support, and how they're going to continue to provide sales. And then operations, which you would generally think would be words talking about what they do and how they're doing it within there. And so I think that those topic models give us some really good buckets to start to evaluate what type of statements that they're doing. And I just wanted to talk a little bit about the network and how it fits together. This is the network of that 100,000, that 69,000 different word pairs that came together, and you can start to see where the groups come out. This section here is the discussions and the language about the global environment. This section here is where CSR is being talked about. This is the section talking and dealing with customers and how they provide service to those customers. And here's the operations, everything from financials to their relations, their operations. And I think the interesting thing to go back and look at this is these words that I've put onto this network. These are the words that fit within those models that you just saw, but they're the words that have the highest amount of centrality within the network. Those are the words that are talked about the most. And so companies are talking about, they're not just talking about bottom line business outcomes. Is it good for business? Is it bad for business? They're talking about their customers. They're talking about how they relate and their responsibility within the community to do that. And they're talking about it in a perspective of them as participants in a global environment and not as a singular organization. So I think it provides us an interesting point to look at. And I think there's some theoretical thoughts I want to leave you with here that I think are coming together. I think legitimacy in terms of organizations trying to adjust their internal values to match the values of society in general. The signaling theory in terms of how they're going about and letting people know that they've done that they've changed that. And stakeholder theory, we see that a lot here in these documents to talk about, or these documents are talking about their engagement and how they're managing their business with respect to their stakeholders, not just with respect to the bottom line business. And I think when we're talking about corporate social responsibility, and especially corporate social responsibility in crisis, when organizations are responding in these theories work in tandem, not just individually, but in tandem, that you have to be, and at least this is my hypothesis I want to study further, is that you have to have legitimacy within the community, and you have to tell people about that, and you have to relate it to your stakeholders all at the same time to do that. And so we'll just move on with that. And so what? So the data suggests that there's something more going on than just profit-focused management. That legitimacy and signaling and stakeholder theories work in tandem in CSR. And it creates a space for us to consider, or in many cases, reconsider CSR as an integral strategic function of business and not just a function of communication or public relations. That it is actually something that organizations take. And just what I think we're going to do next on this is build some larger language models to go and do some computer-aided content analysis to look for some statistical references in that. So thank you very much.
So my name is Douglas Jordan, and I'm a professor of practice at Joint Special Operations University. I'm actually here in a personal capacity. I'm actually on vacation. So the comments that I'm going to give you are my personal comments. They do not represent the Department of Defense, United States Special Operations Command, or Joint Special Operations University. I'm also a doctoral candidate, a recently minted doctoral candidate at Liberty University studying communication. So it's interesting because my original title, you know how you pick a title for your talk and then your title changes, right? Well, I kept my title. 2 years passed, but there's lots of things going on in the world. So since I first started thinking about this, we have Gaza Strip, we have potential famine. I got COVID like a month ago. I didn't think COVID was still out there, but obviously I got COVID. And so there's a lot of things that people talk about lessons learned. So this is my first time at this conference. I'm really a practitioner, I would say, of crisis communication. I retired from the military in 2009. I was a lieutenant colonel. I was a psychological operations officer. So I looked at persuasion and influence. And I was sitting thinking, and I'm like, I remember in 1995, the war in Bosnia, and we said after World War II, there will never be war in Europe ever again. And then it occurred, 1995. I was a young captain. I went to the country of Hungary, which was not in NATO yet. They were a partnership for peace country, but they allowed NATO to come in to help to create peace in Bosnia. I went back in 2002 and I was the director of operation for information in Bosnia. So 9/11 had happened. And so I've had a lot of experience or exposure to crisis communication. What I'd like to talk about, though, is the concept of lessons learned. Okay, because people use that term lessons learned. In July, I think, of last year, I was in Riga, Latvia. I was running a class for NATO partners. Several countries came, and we had 5 delegates from Ukraine who worked in the area of communication for the government of Ukraine. And it was interesting because everybody wanted them to tell them what lessons can be learned so they can implement those changes. And what the delegates realized is that they did not understand if they really had learned any lessons at that time. So I'm going to show you something. I believe I've never been to a conference with a prize table or a candy, what's it called? Candy bar, right? Great ideas. I've written them down. I'm going to take and use these in the future. But I believe that it's a give and take, right? So I'm taking those from the organization, but I brought some books. My university publishes some books. Academics love books. Please take one. Don't take too many, because but you can get more. There's a QR code. You can get the rest of them electronically through PDF. But what's interesting is there's a body of literature out there that maybe you've never been exposed to. And I'm going to show you 2 documents that may be helpful for you for lessons learned. Okay. So my quick agenda, we're going to talk about lessons learned. And then I'm going to show you a book that was actually being published or being written while I was running my seminar. A colleague of mine, Colonel Irina Izotova, who works at the National Defense University of Ukraine, she was actually working on lessons learned while I was trying to teach about lessons learned, and I'll show you her book. And then the implications is these lessons learned can be used in other places. China is looking at Russia. Taiwan is looking at Ukraine. Everyone's looking at Ukraine, but often people are talking about Ukraine without talking to Ukraine, and I'll show how we can have some value there. So one of the things is they call these things lessons learned, but often it's just observations. There's no analysis and there's no implementation. You can't learn a lesson if you don't change. And I'll talk a little bit about that. And then really what a lot of people are calling lessons learned are really just advances in technology. Russia has used Ukraine as a laboratory to use many of their advanced technologies, jamming, electronic warfare, space-based, lots of things. So everyone, I'm sure, has seen drone footage, right? Drones have changed the world, remote submersibles. So things have changed, but the real implication of that is you seeing that is really a communication to you of how things have changed, but it's really technology and then some mistakes. So this is one of many models that's available. It's a NATO model. It's a process, much like your research process. But you notice at the end is we implement it and then we publish. So it's actually applied. Okay, so these techniques may be familiar to you, but this is a NATO process. So now 32 countries as of a couple of days ago. And if you watch the news today, Sweden has showed up to NATO headquarters. They have put their flag. So NATO changed today. But until it implements, we don't have a lesson learned. The model uses this model of .mil PFP. There's a link for the book. I have a hard copy in my bag. I should have brought it up here and waved it around like a prop. But there's a link for it. There's a link for it. And this book gives a structure that, again, has been agreed upon by 32 nations. The ability to get 32 nations to agree to anything is an achievement in itself. That's a case study in influence. Additionally, this book is available. And as an academic, Chapter 6 and Chapter 7. Chapter 6 is Strategic Communication Lessons Learned from Ukraine, which has lesson plans, references, has slide decks. So you can actually go out, get this book, and then get the curriculum if you wanted to bring it in, and it's available to you. Additionally, Chapter 7 is an analysis of Russian information operations. So it's looking at how they are doing their process. So it's something you might want to be interested in. Implications for the future. The upper left is the strike in Jordan. Members of Special Operations Command were present at that location, and that's a terrorist act. The issue of Taiwan, information incursions by using planes going into their airspace. So Taiwan, the airdrop that you see, the middle bottom left, we did airdrops into Kosovo in 1999, and the exact same situations occurred where displaced persons attempted to catch the pallets, and we actually had to stop the exercise or stop the mission to inform the people that it looked very small up in the air, but when they come down, we're dropping something the size of a car. And it's very dangerous. And then the right, COVID. The ability to communicate to people that COVID is still a thing. It's still out there and it can still hurt you. So my contact information, my university is very interested in partnering. And I am personally and professionally very interested in partnering. So if this is something you're interested in, this presentation is available and I'm available. I'll be here for the next couple of days. I'd love to talk to you. Thanks.
I'm just going to speak very briefly. My name is Dr. Jeff Brand, and last semester I taught a class on corporate social and political advocacy, and met for the first time our new graduate student from Russia. And Gigi has actually worked for an international firm in Russia. And so we decided to look at not the companies that left, but rather those that stayed behind, continue to do business, and look at their strategic communication efforts and how they communicated while still doing their work in Russia and Moscow. And we'll get out of the way and let her.
Yeah. I'll carry this away. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm very excited to be here. So the war in Ukraine, which Russia ignited on February 24th, 2022, sparked the shockwave across the globe, affecting the political and social fabric, but also the business landscape. And the imposition of sanctions on Russia prompted a lot of global companies to exit the market, condemning their behavior and distancing themselves from the aggressor. But most does not mean all. And some of the companies still stayed in Russia, adjusted their social media strategies, and flew relatively under the radar. So we're going to look at those companies today. For a mixed method analysis, we looked at 5 different companies that were mostly headquartered in France or Germany, had business to business and business to customer sales models, were from FMCG, construction, cosmetics fields, and were relatively popular among the Russian customer. But due to our time constraints, we're only going to look at the 3 of them. It's Leroy Merlin, Yves Rocher, and Bosch, specifically Bosch Power Tools. It is important to note that before the invasion, all of those companies were very active on social media, on Instagram, YouTube, and on the local Russian social media website called VK, which you can think of it as a Russian Facebook. So as for the results, we've noticed a few trends and a few strategies that companies utilized in order to stay and maintain their operations. 2 of the 3 companies, Leroy Merlin and Yves Rocher, decided to completely switch to a local Russian social media website, VK, and continue their social media presence there. As for trends, the number of posts declined in 2022, which is not surprising, obviously, but in 2023, it rebounded almost to the same level as it was pre-war. The type of content also changed. Previously diverse, it was now mostly focused on product information and promotions. But there's an obvious outlier in those companies. Bosch Power Tools decided to adopt quote unquote silent mode, which meant that they completely ceased all of their social media activities, including the Russian social media website. What they did instead, they opted for third-party vendors to promote their products. They would prepare materials and collaborate with those vendors who would display their materials on their websites. A little side note, when the invasion happened, when Russia invaded Ukraine, I had been working at Bosch Power Tools for 4 years. So I've witnessed crisis management teams come up with the silent mode and implement that and experience all kinds of challenges with that. So to conclude, these are vibrant examples of how companies can adapt and shift their focuses in order to maintain their operations, even in the most tumultuous of times. But it is important to not misrepresent this or misunderstand this. It's not to say that those companies did not face repercussions at all. No, they had to significantly downsize their businesses in order to maintain their business in Russia. So this is all for me.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm Corina Buzanu, and together with my colleague Alina Covanu from SNXPA Romania, I'm going to be presenting today some of the work that we have done on disinformation in the context of the war in Ukraine. First of all, our perspective is a bit different, of course, biased, because we are in Romania. This means Eastern Europe, and have been facing the, let's say, challenges of the current war in Ukraine, and they are quite a bit differently than compared to other countries. What I will be presenting today is the result of a mixed method approach, where we're trying to understand and to analyze the relationship between the strategic narratives and the public perception in Romania by analyzing social media. And I think that the main statement of our work and our presentation today is this title, that the narratives may be fake, but the confusion and the polarization and the fatigue that they trigger are absolutely real. And this is actually what we are facing in social media in Romania, but not only in Romania, it's also visible in Poland and in other countries. And I think it's also visible in your countries if we take the honesty to look at it that way. We departed from the idea we want to explore the cognitive warfare in the context of the Ukrainian war by mapping the strategic narratives and the mirror tactics that we borrowed from the military and international relations, and to see how these were used in order to target Romanian public and evaluate their effects. Of course, we have been doing this by exploring social media, but also by analyzing the results of a public opinion survey that was conducted online. We all know that, of course, now we're facing a new information and communication ecosystem, and this has brought us several changes. And one of the most important changes is that today the technology has actually blurred the differences and between information and communication, but external and external boundaries between what we consider war and what we consider peace, reality and fiction. And all these together lead us to the idea that today the general public, and there is a general perception that it is a blurred distinction between persuasion, propaganda, information, and entertainment. Most of the disinformation and fake news are spread by entertainment, unfortunately. We draw our data on the current reports, and one of the most important reports that we draw on is the EDMO report on disinformation and the war in Ukraine, that mentions that disinformation is not only a problem related to the platform, because it's not anymore about technology and platform. Of course, it's very much helped by technology, but it's everywhere. And it's in social media, but it's also in mainstream media, it's in legacy media, it's in word of mouth, it's in how people communicate in their daily life. And of course, it's spread by high-profile politicians and influencers, again, unfortunately for all of us. And we also draw from the idea that this connectivity and this world of hyper-connectivity that we have, online media environments, digitalization, social media, and internet-based technologies have lead us to actually creating an unstable world that we see it today. And we're talking about connectivity conflicts, but we're also talking, as Leonard mentioned, to an age of unpeace. And we in Eastern Europe, we feel it deeply, this age of unpeace. The conceptual framework, which I will not go very much into deep because I must say we are coming from communication science, not on international relations or military studies. The conceptual framework of what we're doing is rather volatile because it's not mainly related to what we're doing. But these are the three concepts that we have been using: the cognitive warfare, strategic narratives, and mirror tactics. And I will be hoping that I will have more time to show you what we found out when we wanted to see departing from the strategic narrative that have been used and getting to what the public is perceiving about everything that is going on there. The cognitive warfare is, of course, a new type of war, but what we know for sure, looking at the reports, is that it's a type of war that is using at the same time this element, disinformation, propaganda, cyber attacks, hostile information campaigns, and so on and so forth. And what is really not helpful in this war, new type of war, is the fact that it is fostered by a completely changed communication and information ecosystem. And the main problem is that the very connectivity of the new ecosystem is something that leads that everything can be weaponized. And this is something that it's really hard to fight with. And we don't have the instruments and the tools, and we don't have the resources to fight this. What this cognitive warfare aims, and what we have seen it in Romania, it aims to blur the distinctions, as mentioned, between fact and fiction. It disorientates and disconnects people, and it creates a lot of polarization. But what is also very important, because it creates the impression of unveiling a hidden truth. And as social media does, the cognitive warfare does it very well. In a very professional manner, I would say, it empowers audiences that were left behind. And this is why it is so productive, and it's going so well. It unveils a hidden truth and gives people and audiences the perception that they figured it out somehow, and that they found out something important. Extremely important from what we found out is that it aims to disrupt public conversations and to cultivate doubt and suspicion, but it is not interested in actually explaining situations or convincing about something in specific. Its overall goal is to create cognitive and emotional polarization. And if we are honest to each other, it really succeeded. And it's going very well, unfortunately. I will go further. I don't know how much.
Go ahead.
2 minutes.
I'll yield 2 minutes of my time. Keep going. Keep going. Keep going. Yes.
So going further in a speedy way, what we have done? Well, we have used a mixed method approach, and we tried to first identify the strategic narratives in the literature as we can find them. And we relied on the literature, and we also relied on the reports that were issued by several international organizations and also by European Union. And then we mapped the prevailing strategic narratives and mirror tactics in Romanian social media. And here we used CrowdTangle, but not only CrowdTangle, and we did a lot of qualitative analysis of the Facebook pages. And then we tried to explore how they were mentioned, the strategic narratives, and to identify the mirror tactics. And at the end, we tried to track the way that these strategic narratives have been internalized by the Romanian public throughout online survey that was conducted in March 2023. It was an online panel, of course, so the data has its limits, of course, and we must look at the data throughout these limitations. But what we found out is, and we think it's extremely interesting and worth mentioning. First, these are the strategic narratives that we have encountered in the Romanian social media, the Romanian mass media, but not only in Romania. You can find it in Bulgaria, you can find it in Hungary, and you can find it in Poland. The reclaim of the historical territories currently belonging to Ukraine. This is one of the dominant strategic narratives. The Ukrainian war costs a lot of money. I think you can also have this narrative here in the US. And the Ukraine refuses to make peace. There are several others, maybe other strategic narratives, but we have picked only these 3 ones because I knew I don't have enough time. But I could share more of this strategic narratives. It's not only in Romania, as mentioned, but it relies on some historical information that we got when we were in school. that Ukraine is an artificial state that took territories from different neighbors several years ago. And this is something that people can relate to, because this is the strategic narrative. It's actually a story that people can relate to and has something to do with the past. And it's also targeting Romanian, Polish and Hungarian public. The Ukrainian war costs very much, and there were many pictures in social media, but also in mass media circulating and trying to mirror Romanian children that were in poverty, and Romanians were being in poverty, and Ukrainians being helped and full of resources by taking money from the Romanians and giving them to the Ukrainians. And Ukraine does not want peace. And this is the third strategic narrative. I won't go into that. In referring to the mirror tactics, we found out there are two mirror tactics: fake fact-checking, the fact that everyone does fact-checking, all sides do fact-checking now. So this means that you cannot rely, or you cannot actually acknowledge what fact-checking is today. This is one of the mirror tactics, and the weaponization of freedom of speech. And I think that this can be found in all countries, and we can use a lot of that, of course. And this is not new, the fake fact-checking. This was also in previous wars, so you could easily track it. But this one with the weaponization of freedom of speech, I think it has some roots, and it has been spread a lot by the use of technology. The last part of what we have been doing in terms of research instruments, we conducted a survey. It was an online panel in Romania, so it has several limits. But what we found out, I think it's really interesting in looking at too, and it's interesting in seeing, in looking at it as a pilot and then replicating it and trying to go into it more deep. If you, I don't know if you can see it, I can't read that, so I have difficulties in reading that, but I think that what we have from this panel, from this online survey, is that Romanians should first take care of their own citizens, and then help Ukrainians. This is one of the dominant perception. And the Ukrainian refugees are a burden for our economy, for our society, and that we're putting a lot of the resources that we need for our domestic issues. And this 74% Romanians should first take its own citizens and then take care of the Ukrainian refugees. This is very much similar to the strategic narrative that we just saw, unfortunately. And in terms of sources, again, communication sources, I think this is extremely important, because it also points out that it's not the credibility of the source, of the information source, of the one who is communicating and spreading out the messages, that is important in this disinformation war and in this cognitive war. It's not about the credibility of the source, but it's about its power to create confusion and polarization and fatigue. So people in Romania, in our panel, distrust Russia, distrust Vladimir Putin, and distrust everything that comes from there. But on the other hand, they internalize what these sources, which they consider not worthy for trust, they internalize those. And I can read that. And just mapping the results, we have on the left side of the screen the key strategic narrative, what was communicated, the 3 months that they reclaimed the historical territories, that the Ukrainian war costs a lot, and that Ukrainian people can make peace. In the middle, we have the mirror tactics, and that everyone does fact-checking. A lot of Russian outlets do a lot of fact-checking. The weaponization of freedom of speech. And on the right side of the screen, we have the perception that we found in the online survey. And what we see is that the second strategic narrative, the Ukrainian war costs a lot, can be mirrored and it seemed to be internalized in our survey. And in terms of mirror tactics, we found out that it is the weaponization of the freedom of speech leads us to the idea that indeed Romanians do not trust the sources. They don't trust most of the sources, but they do trust, they internalize, and they're convinced of the strategic narratives and of the effects of the mirror tactics. Thank you.
So while that gets going, I'll just start speaking, if that's all right, just so we can save a little bit. The beginning of my presentation is a slide. If you just imagine here, close your eyes, it'll come on screen eventually. If you imagine it, it's going to be a lot of pictures. So this topic is a long interest of mine. As you can see, I have done many work in Ukraine. The book that talks about it on resilient communication through flooding and there as well. And I actually 2 research and advanced training events in Kiev and in Dnipro in 2018 and 2019, supported by NATO Science for Peace and Security programs. So well, my talk today is going to really focuses on the intersection of resilience and communication messages. You know, why is it important? Why are we talking about this, and how does it tie into this whole panel where everyone is talking about resiliency is being used as not only a buzzword but as a topic through all different. That's probably the commonality of everyone. Even though not everyone said the word, I'm sure we can find the word somewhere in their data. From businesses to social media to military to humanitarian aid. You know, we're all doing our best to build this kind of metaphor, this idea, this theory on resilience. And so simply put, if we really kind of distill it, you know, we're really thinking about the trust of government and its citizens, foundation upon which resilience is kind of built on, you know, that we believe that there's a commitment to the citizens, the population's kind of well-being and safety. If you really kind of come down to what we're thinking about in this aspects. But in post-war communities, you know, not only there could be some, you know, credibility gaps that can have emerged, but also that there might be some more need to help with moving citizens to resources to help them use resources and trust and ability to do it. So my work kind of look at the communication strategies that not only should be prepared about before the war started, during, but ongoing even afterwards of building resilience so it could reduce resistance and along with messages that are targeting both internal and external government organizations. And so what I found 3 common purposes. So one of them is to ignite the recovery process. The second is promote adaptive functioning. And third is to enhance this skill sets around coping with past trauma and disinformation campaigns, which, you know, I had to throw that word in there to give my 2 minutes there. And so we look into my second slide here. I kind of distill my study to 4 key elements. And because of time, I'm just going to outline directions of the work that's currently in process of addressing this. So first, my study kind of highlights how there's an identification process and coping with trauma that needs to be thoroughly developed and it can help with building resilience. You know, in aftermath of such crisis and conflict, where, you know, we're openly discussing our feelings, our experiences, our needs. A lot of times in the news, you hear mostly what went wrong as opposed to what went well. And kind of how do you help to start the process to heal, right? And so while this might be a painful process and a process that's not structurally well based on, as we've heard from others on this panel, from entertainment businesses and other communication channels, you know, how different stakeholders and plus there's this identification and needs process that needs to be built to be moved forward. My second point ties into how resilience building goes to ignite recovery and functioning. And this you've seen a lot of, and for many people on the panel here, you know, in Matt's work and others in the room of looking at how resilience can actually foster recovery and build back better in the future. And here, what I really want to come across is that resilience is not necessarily just avoiding distress. It's not necessarily something that you're reactive towards. It's actually something how we manage and how we adapt in the process moving forward. And so, and then my third kind of big takeaway that I wanted to share with you all is this idea of, you know, when it comes to resistance, which is another growing buzzword, that when we reduce resistance, it's also kind of tied into this idea of building resistance. It's building resilience. So many R's, talking so quick, apologize for that. But it's this, in order to have effective communication, we must be aware of that. You know, we're trying to build on resilience. It could actually get to the point where the message is being resisted as we're building. And so this can be looked at in practice in terms of fears, doubts, things that are natural after a crisis, and things that we must be aware and we must, address constructively together, from bottom up, top down, all together, sweeping together, in order to avoid any long-term, situations there. And then the last bit, which, another commonality that everyone heard here is about trust and communication and I put in more public security and well-being to anchor it, trying to capture everyone here in the panel. I think we all are trying to improve the population's well-being and their security. And so with that, I'll close with just kind of giving you a quick summary of not only what you've heard in the panel, but also from the work that I'm sharing with you here, is that we must kind of be careful with our attention to the identification of needs, the resilience building, the reducing resistance, and fostering trust, not only in conflict and future crisis, but specifically with work being done in Ukraine and our colleagues that are working there. With that, I'll thank you and yield the rest of my time to the discussion.
Thank you.
I could have yielded more of my time.
You were great. So I appreciate everybody, trying to adhere to the time. I know it's challenging when we have so many things to say. I did want to leave some time for discussion because I know there are lots of people in the studio audience here who have many things to add about the conflict of Ukraine from a communication perspective. I can take, several minutes of time to talk, but let's open it up to the audience. And are there any questions or things you would like to comments you'd like to make? Yes. Yes.
Thank you for the presentation. It's very interesting, and I think we do need a better linkage between sort of communication and content and then people's perceptions. So I really appreciate that. But I do have a question. And I was thinking about disinformation as sort of reinforcing, underlying prejudice or sort of a way of, rather than changing things, reinforcing things that are often. And I was wondering, can we be sure that there is a link between the strategic messages? Sorry.
I didn't get that because of the applause.
Yeah. Can we sort of be sure that there is a link between the strategic messages and the internalization of the population? Because the statement you had that we should take care of Romanian first, sort of, that's sort of an entrenched populist belief that is quite popular across nations now. And how do you reflect on that? Because if they don't trust the sources, maybe it's something other, a political attitude is something we can capture in the public.
Thank you for the question. They don't trust the sources, but they don't trust the politicians, because in building trust, you need to have powerful politicians, in terms of credible politicians and well-equipped public institutions. We don't have that in Romania, so we solved the case quite quickly with that. We're fine doing that. So in fighting disinformation and fake news and in fighting this cognitive war, the first step that you have to do is have powerful institutions and good public communication. So yes, that's true. But when looking at strategic narratives that we know and we have picked up in the reports, and we can see that these strategic narratives have been appear in the perception of the public. And it's not just because we should take care of the Romanian first, because this does not appear in other contexts. If we ask people, because we did several other surveys, if we ask people about the COVID-19 pandemic, for instance, it's not, the narrative is not prevailing there. So it's something that relates to the fact that we are giving money to the Ukrainians and instead of giving money to the Romanian children, which is actually quite false, because you don't take the money from the children and you give them to the refugees. It's not going that way. But the Russian propaganda in Romania is doing a great job, unfortunately, in actually communicating that we should first help the Romanians, the Polish, and all the other countries in the region instead of helping the Ukrainians. Avoiding to say that if we don't help the Ukrainians, it's coming after us, because this is the reality. And this is what we know in Romania, that we're not next, but Republic of Moldova is next.
and other countries in the region are next.
Yeah, another way to think about that credibility question is to think about the credibility that's built into the narratives, that the message themselves carry credibility. So the concept of narrative fidelity and narrative coherence can be really helpful in understanding how those narratives function. So.
Yeah, and they relate to, of course, some historical stories that we know that
Yeah.
Ukraine took some territories from Romania, but Bulgaria also took. So we had this reclaim of historical territories with other countries as well. As most of the countries have some conflict regarding dispute and territorial disputes, of course, in Europe, we can see that.
So one of the things I think a lot of people don't realize is the sheer scale of some of our adversaries' investment in malign influence. And I have colleagues who they cannot get their head around, we have an organization, NATO, of maybe 100 people. There's just Wagner Group. Right now, there's a active campaign. We've identified that there are false news organizations operating in the United States, still funded by Wagner Group, that are running as US newspapers online. And what they've done is they've done a lot of research on the target audience. And the goal is not to convince you, the goal is to disrupt, to create confusion, to terrorize. And I think that it's one of those things where there's a great book called Duped by Tim Levine. Human beings are defaulted to trust. And then we have to erode that trust to get them to doubt politicians and institutions and NATO and the World Health Organization. So this is a very sophisticated process against you, against me. And Sunny and I actually met in Ukraine, but we wrote a paper about China. There's indications that China ran a disinformation campaign about COVID to hurt you. And people, I know it's not what people want to hear, but there are indicators based on social science that was conducted. So I think this is a very interesting conversation. And Ukraine is the center of a focus of disinformation right now.
Andreas.
So given these insights, I always wonder, also an observation of what is happening in Germany, there's a lot of disinformation there too, which not only goes through social media, but also through the support of certain political parties that are actually Nazis, different from the Ukrainian government.
It's everywhere.
But what I always wonder is, for example, also German politicians, why are they not more aggressively talking about that? Disclosing more aggressively what is happening. Is there a reason for that? Is that strengthening these like polarizing discussions, or do intelligence organizations do not want to give away their insights and secrets, or why is there not more aggressive talk about that?
And not only aggressive talk, why aren't they doing so?
I think one of the challenges in the US is the, power of the First Amendment and free speech. So there are some organizations and some groups in this country who object to the US government intervening in that communication because they view it as inconsistent with the government's responsibilities around free speech. So, for example, there is a Supreme Court case right now, maybe it's a federal case right now, to limit the ability of the US Centers for Disease Control to counter disinformation about vaccines and about emerging infectious diseases. And the idea is that countering of that misinformation is really targeting a particular viewpoint or particular perspective, which is inconsistent with the First Amendment. So I think we've had several people talk about the challenges of free speech and how free speech has been weaponized, in this information terrorist war. It is a very significant problem in terms of how do you balance free access, free speech to information against this, what the World Health Organization calls the infodemic.
If I just can add one sentence, they are fighting, the actors of disinformation, they're fighting with the same weapons and with the same tools and concepts of the ones that are being targeted. They're fighting with fact checking, and they're destroying the fact checking, the idea of fact checking by spreading false fact checking, and they're now weaponizing the freedom of speech. It's unfortunately for us, it's a masterpiece of what they do. And it's very difficult to fight back because they're pushing the button of freedom of speech, and they're pushing the button of fact checking.
I mean, just to add on top of that, and great question. I've seen it that not only it's doing that, but it leads to this outcome of widening this credibility gap, right? The trust that you're building, even if it's an official, disclosing early stuff, if you're attacking at the different areas, it creates that eventually that one slip up by that politician, and it leads to this, again, oh, they're not credible. They misspoke, or they.
Personal risk. You become a target. People that position themselves as champions of free speech or anti-disinformation become a target of disinformation, and revenge porn, artificial intelligence, again.
Yeah. Yes,
So, Dr. Seeger, actually,
I didn't make any presentations, so I don't have to answer. Okay, all right.
I
Yes.
yielded enough time that you should have hit
Okay.
that time, right?
You're going to put me on the spot.
and thank you for putting this in, but that it's important to talk about the context of
Yes.
war within risk and crisis communication. So as a theorist of risk and crisis communication, I'm curious what you believe is that the context of war can help risk and crisis communication to evolve, and vice versa. What can risk and crisis communication theory offer to unlike?
Yeah. So Martin's going to take a lot of notes here because, he's very interested in these topics of how crisis communication fits into war. In fact, Andreas and I have had this conversation a couple times about how crisis communication needs to be much more engaged in these kinds of conflict and war. So for many years, the field as it developed was really focused on corporate communication. And I think many of us sort of steered away from these questions of global conflict, such as a war. But from my perspective, as I've begun to look more and more at these circumstances, and particularly examining the questions of cascading and converging crises, that this is a perfect place to explore that phenomena. And I'm doing some work in supply chains right now, and how crisis affects supply chains. And the impact on the supply chains of both COVID-19 and of Ukraine have been just astronomical. I think more than anyone really anticipated. So we've not only seen disruptions to the global food supply, but we've seen disruptions to fundamental resources and technologies that are used in, for example, the production of microchips. So I think we have to understand it at least from the perspective of cascading and converging crises. But I think more directly, war creates casualties. It creates harm. It creates uncertainty. It's often, kind of a surprising event. And we have to respond quickly to be able to manage the implications of war. Those are the three defining characteristics of a crisis. So I would say it's a challenge to the field, but I think the field really needs to aggressively begin to talk about this as a way in which we can apply the principles of crisis communication to these kinds of events. And I'm pleased to see people talking about the corporate dimensions as well as other kinds of dimensions. So, yes.
Thank you for these intriguing presentations. I have one question I would like the panel to answer. According to my observation, I also understood that from the panel today, the disinformation is only a small part of the overall problem, right? So also when I look at the discussion in the academic community in Germany, the focus, we are always focusing on disinformation. There are empirical studies trying to figure out, okay, how much disinformation is out there, and it always seems to find only a very small portion, which is, in my opinion, also due to methodological problems, because it's hard to capture, it's hard to measure. But isn't it a bigger problem actually the strategic narratives and how they slip through the channels of seemingly trustworthy communication? Like, I really found it very intriguing. I think we call them neural tactics. So the messages somehow slip through, and it doesn't even matter anymore if people distrust Russia or the Russian government because the messaging is well placed or something. And it's probably kind of effective. You also have problems with measuring the effects, I guess, but I assume also it's very effective. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, anyone from the panel?
I could continue for an hour.
But continue for a few minutes.
A few minutes. Thank you. Yes, indeed. Very true and very correct. Some of the strategic narratives can't even be labeled as disinformation, because once they say Ukraine took territories from Romania, you can't dispute, can't argue that, because it's true. But of course, it's not in the Romanians' interest to go back onto that narrative and to tackle this situation, because you would have other problems if you would go there. So yes, it's very difficult to label what is disinformation and what is not. It's easier to label the strategic narratives because we know what strategic narratives are. It's difficult to track what they have done in the public perception, and that is true. I think that what we're missing indeed is a methodology in order to actually look very careful in this kind of data. I'm not sure if we would have a methodology, things would change, unfortunately, for the academia and for what we can do now in the situation. But yes, indeed, this cognitive warfare has blurred the distinction between what is information and what is disinformation. And it confuses people and it disorientates people. And the polarization is so high that it's really very hard to fight back.
Yeah, I agree. I think for me, it's easier to measure the effect of the disinformation because we can see the disruption that it causes. It's harder to operationalize something to where we can identify specific messages as that is a disinformation message right there, because the lines are blurred. And there's just enough truth in what they're talking about or issue that they're talking about that builds this credibility. I mean, for us here in the United States, this notion of reclaimed lands and territories is, we scratch our heads over it and we don't know what that means. But for anybody who grew up in the region in Western Ukraine, which was part of Poland and Lithuania at one point, and part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire at one point, and part of the USSR at one point, this notion of these changing boundaries and how people identify with that, it's generational. And so, we could probably point to the effect of this. The effect is, and we saw it in one of your social media posts where it had the children of Romania versus the children of Ukraine, which were all fat and happy and well clothed and not living in a shed, and the Romanians were living in a shed and looked emaciated. And that speaks to this. To me, it's a very subtle way to scratch at this kind of regionalism that has been pervasive for so many generations. So it's hard to move beyond that. We can't operationalize that. But I think what's important to do is to continue to chip away at pointing out we can measure the effect. If we can measure the effect, then we can point to it and say, okay, what is causing that effect? Now we can start to look at these causal connections and these correlations between them and to say, when people talk about this, this is why they're talking about this. It's not a perfect answer. And in this business, explaining is losing. When, or as I like to say, the second liar doesn't have a chance at this table because the first liar has already set the terms for what was going to be talked about.
So can I pull a thread? So what he just said is anything counter, you're behind. right? And so having plans, having procedures, techniques, resistance and resilience, psychologically hardening, inoculation type activities. So I sit in a lot of these meetings and I hear this term happen over and over and over. And I'm probably the only communication scholar in most of these meetings, whether they're NATO, the Department of Defense, my university. One of the things is think back to when you first heard the term disinformation. It's actually a new term for an old thing. It's deception because someone is doing or saying something to you to hurt you, right? And we're defaulted to, hey, why would anyone lie to me about medicine or health or war or, famine? And they do it because they have an objective. One of the things I think about is these are rhetorical moves. They're looking at you and figuring out what your vulnerability is. And I'm going to use a communication strategy to achieve my effect, which might be disruption, misinformation, disinformation. I just want people to fight. And someone could probably come up with a topic in this room that we could all fight about because we all come from our perspective. So if you want to disrupt it, the problem is we do not have good terms of reference. We keep throwing a new term. And actually, what's the term, Sonny? Malinformation. I just heard in the car 2 days ago, malinformation. Never heard that one before. But we keep coming up as scholars, new terms. So cognitive security is a NATO term. So what I like to see is when scholars do work, they hang their theory and their methodology on something that exists so I can go back and validate it. And right now it's like, man, every day someone comes up with something else. I'm chasing theory and everyone's getting published and everything's just as good. One comment made yesterday or last week, I was in an artificial intelligence conference. There are 3,300 companies that all do large language models. Which one's right? They're all the same, right? But they'll all take my money.
Yeah, I think this point about the way we're defining dis and misinformation is really important. We've used those terms interchangeably here. The way in which the researchers are currently, and we don't know what tomorrow will bring, defining those terms, is disinformation is unintentional, where we didn't necessarily intend to mislead someone, but misinformation is intentional. It's an intentional deception. And I think many crisis communication people really have struck. Do I have this flipped? Do I have this flipped? I'm sorry. Yeah. The many communication people, crisis communication people never imagined that during a crisis, there would be this intentional effort to deceive people. We saw this in COVID-19, where there were economic incentives for people to provide deceptive information about various kinds of treatments that could be used. So this is from my perspective, at least, having been in this field for a while, this is a relatively new phenomena in crisis communication, but it's been something that's been evident in war when we use communication in war since forever. So I do think, I take your point, obviously, I can confuse the terms as well. So I take your point that the terms are not clear. I just want to ask or mention something to Gigi about her presentation, which I found really interesting. I think we're going to have to go back and revise Bill Benoit's theory now, theory of image repair, because this idea of going silent as a strategy for image repair or image defense, I think is really quite interesting. So I think, again, this is an important place where we can contribute to our understanding by virtue of this particular event. So I really appreciated that. Yes.
A question for you said that you found out that the companies were less talking about the profit or the bottom line, and actually that the topic models were global CSR, customer and operation. And then I was actually wondering, would you not say for the companies staying behind them at least, that these are more like legitimacy strategies, not because it is about bottom line and the profit, I would say so, and that that it's perhaps even some kind of business ethical washing or you, I don't find it.
A little whitewashing of their image a little bit.
Yeah, because they decide to stay and.
I think, and I didn't look at this and Gigi raised a point about the difference between B2B and B2C and business to consumer versus business to business type of commerce or business. And that, I think it's going to be interesting to go back and look at companies that are primarily customer focused in terms they're selling something, they have some type of service that they're selling to a mass audience compared to a business selling to a business. I think that the likelihood, possible hypothesis here, the likelihood is going to increase for companies that have more consumer exposure to have a position that aligns with the broader norms and values of the society which they live in. Whereas a company that maybe provides pipe fittings for oil pipelines, they're still going to provide pipe fittings for oil pipelines. That those types of where there's not a lot of consumers that are taking advantage of their services, that those numbers, you will start to see some movements. Here are the companies that stay tend to be more business to business focused versus those that have more consumers, especially have more consumers in the West. I think you're going to see that. I think that there is something to be said specifically about that. But I also think that, and I did not look specifically at companies that stayed. I only looked at the companies that left. But I think if you're looking at the companies that stay, most, and one of the reasons I did not look at them is that most did not announce their decision to stay. Most just stayed. They did not publicize it. They did not talk about it. They just continued to do business. And some did announce, some said that they were going to stay, but most did not. And so most of if you look at the two databases, whether it's the Yale database or if you look at the one from the Kiev School of Economics, most of the statements in there are from companies that left or curtailed some type of business in there.
I guess I will add something which might be a little bit of a counterpoint, that those companies that primarily posted CSR were focused on that. In 2023, those who stayed opted for product-based content, and some completely abandoned CSR. And there's an interesting thing about the Russian audience is that they do not expect companies to perform CSR. They expect the bottom line of there's a product, low price, and that's all that we need. So those companies that before war were pushing the CSR image had to kind of battle back and lessen that content entirely.
I think when we were talking about this topic and looking at like some of the Yale positions and so forth, I don't know how concurrent it all was, but there was a point where some of the companies she was studying were listed as having left. But because they kind of cut back their operations, went silent, or whatever, they were still doing business. But on the outset, in terms of the public outcry and some of the publicity and threats of boycotts, they were listed in groups of having left Russia. So they were able to kind of duck under the whole process and keep doing business, even though people looking at them might have thought they had left.
Interesting reputational management strategy.
Well, in the world of social media, to go silent seems counterintuitive in a lot of ways, right? But this is working.
Did you see a difference when the list sponsored of war was published?
I'm less familiar with the data from Yale and so forth.
I think what companies know is that the public forgets about these things. This gets online, they're on social media, they stay there, people do a lot of buzz, there's a lot of resentment, but companies know that this will go away from the social media agenda, and they rely on that. And of course, we know it's happening. So yeah, companies that did not exit Russia didn't made it public, but they knew that people won't pay very much attention to that.
I think we are supposed to be at a reception now, which will be a very fun thing. So thank you all for coming and thank you very much to our panelists.